The Rosemary Magee Creativity Conversations are always a treat for any and all wise hearts who seek knowledge, especially those of us who seek and find inspiration in creativity, imagination, and innovation, the themes that this conversation series explores across disciplines. Our conversation today features two very special guests, Rosemary Magee and Professor Joseph Crespino, who will be exploring together the creative processes that led to Professor Crespino's new book, Atticus Finch, the Biography, available for purchase today, but not available to the public until next week. So by way of brief introduction of our guests, Rosemary Magee, for whom the Creativity Conversations were recently named, is currently a research fellow at Emory, and until recently served as director of the Rose Library. I know her first and foremost as a close colleague and my mentor. Professor Joseph Crespino is Jimmy Carter Professor of American History and specializes in 20th century United States history and the American South post-Reconstruction. He is the author of several books in addition to his newest one, including Strom Thurmond's America and In Search of Another Country, Mississippi and the Conservative Counter-Revolution. Today's creativity conversation will give us, the audience, an inside look at Professor Crespino's research and writing process, revealing for us the story behind his new book. Part of that story are the sources, the letters and other archival materials that Professor Crespino drew from to reveal how Harper Lee's father served as the inspiration for the character of Atticus Finch across her two novels. This part of the story includes an interesting twist, in that Professor Crespino's research led to the Rose Library's recent acquisition of Harper Lee materials acquired from the rare book dealer Paul Kennerson, in which Rosemary happened to be deeply involved. And so this conversation is also going to give us an inside look at the story behind these unique sources that are behind the book. We'll also have the opportunity, if you didn't beforehand, to purchase an advance copy of the book, as well as to see the Harper Lee materials on display here this evening. And I would be remiss if I did not note that after today, those materials are available for research and public use in the Rose Reading Room on the 10th floor. So you see what a treat we have in store for us today. I want to thank Yolanda Cooper, University Librarian, who is in attendance with us, as well as our generous sponsors for their support of this event, the Center for Creativity in the Arts, Emory College, the Emory History Department, and the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry. Thank you all, and thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Rosemary.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I remember Ginger Smith saying upon her return to the library one evening, saying, it's great to be at an event where I didn't feel I was responsible for setting up the chairs or doing the PowerPoint or just engage in a conversation with my friend and colleague. And we've had many creativity conversations, I feel, Joe, but on the quadrangle, in your office, in the Rose Library, and just many chance encounters. So it's really nice to have this opportunity to have one more publicly and more formally on such a wonderful occasion. And congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This is a great honor for me to be part of this great lineage of creative conversations you've had. So this is a real thrill for me. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for being here. So I really want to start at the very beginning, which, as you will recall from The Sound of Music, is a very good place to start.
Yes.
And what was the inspiration for you to write this book, which is not a traditional, conventional history book, but has some other interesting and unique features? What inspired you?
Well, there's a long story and there's a short story. I'll give you the short story.
Okay, then I'll ask you some questions.
But there are many different kind of origin stories for this book. And I've been thinking about the various ones over the last several weeks as I thought about this question. I mean, one is I had a great set of teachers as an undergraduate. And I was in an interdisciplinary major. I was at Northwestern in American Studies. They called it American Culture. And from the very start, when I was thinking about history and literature, I never thought of them as kind of separate entities, but they were always, these twin entities that informed each other in vital ways. So that was part of my education from the very start. I didn't have one of these moments when I was a child when I remember reading To Kill a Mockingbird and it changed my life. And a lot of people have those moments, but that wasn't me. I vaguely remember reading it either in 8th grade or 9th grade. I'm not really sure.
You have read it since then.
I have read it a couple of times
Just check.
since then. And the way I came back to the novel is I have my brother, who was 2 years older than me, he just had a ton of quirky interests. He watched, for 14 years straight, he didn't miss an episode of Days of Our Lives, the soap opera. He was a huge fan of Belinda Carlisle and the Go-Go's. And he loved Harper Lees To Kill a Mockingbird. And when I was in graduate school and I was studying Southern history and political history, and my brother was like, you've got to reread To Kill a Mockingbird. You've got to reread To Kill a Mockingbird. And so I did. And it was amazing. And it just, it reminded me then that of just the kind of unique role this book plays in our culture, the way it becomes a kind of primer for 8th graders and 9th graders, who are learning for the first time about America's history of racial injustice, and they have this model of kind of racial morality, and so many people read it, and it's so complicated, and there's so little written about it because Harper Lee said so little about it. The last public interview she ever gave was in March of 1964, and then there was nothing else. So it just made me I knew that this is something that I would have to come back to.
So a seed was planted at that
absolutely.
point. I'm aware that you use literature in your teaching as well. In your research, I'm supposing, is also beyond this book. And you're a big fan of Wendell Berry.
Yes.
And I believe you include him in some of your teaching as well. So where do you see, you already talked about history and literature being intertwined, but where do you see, is there a line between fact and fiction then?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
It's a little.
Yeah, I mean, it's hazy, but yeah. I mean, as a historian, I have to say, absolutely.
Okay, got it.
There are facts out there, and I've spent most of my career interested in the facts. But of course, how we interpret facts and how we think about them and how we remember things. The facts never wholly tell the story. And the stories that we tell and the fictions that we write certainly shape the way we see those facts. And literature can bring alive history in so many fantastic ways. We just finished, I have some students in here, we just finished this course on wealth and poverty in American history. And we read the last thing we read was this amazing story by George Saunders, The Simplica Girl Diaries, which is about this guy who is just, just struggling to stay afloat, but wants to give his family, his children every opportunity. And it's this weird, it's George Saunders, so it's this weird dystopian sort of story that's just bizarre, but wonderful. And the students, totally responded to it. So,
well, Salman Rushdie once said, actually, in one of these creativity conversations, that Sherlock Holmes was as an important figure in history and was known by as many people as anybody else on Earth, basically, was his point. And so that brings us to the character of Atticus Finch. So you've written about him. He is a fictional creation out of the mind and heart and experience of Harper Lee. But I've just finished reading your book, the advanced copy of your book. And we see Atticus assuming kind of a reality, a kind of tangibility in a way that he already assumes for many of us in our imaginations, hence the controversy over the two different versions of Atticus Finch in Harper Lee's writing. Mm-hmm. So what did you learn about the character of Atticus as you were working on this project?
Well, before I get to that directly, I mean, it is interesting the way that the character of Atticus Finch, people talk about him as though he's a real person.
Right.
I mean, and it's amazing in kind of these unthinking ways. More than any kind of literary character that I can think of, people talk about Atticus like he's a real person. Like if you go to the press let out some early copies to these Amazon reviewers, and one of the reviewers, gave me like 2 stars, and the review was, I read this book because I really wanted to learn a lot about Atticus Finch's childhood. There's nothing in this book about his childhood. And you're like, I mean, what can you do?
I missed that chapter.
Yeah. So, but I mean, the title itself is kind of playing on that, right? The biography.
Yes.
Not even a biography, but the biography.
Yeah, the official authorized biography.
So yeah, it's an odd thing about the character. But in terms of what I learned about the character, it really began, this project began, I had wanted to write about, and I did write about the character in graduate school, but there was so little to go on. There was just the novel. And these things that Harper Lee had said about the novel, and some other pieces that she had written that had been picked over by many people, and there was nothing else. But the turning point for me was when Ghost at a Watchman was published in 2015.
And had you been working on this already prior to
Well,
that?
I had an idea of coming back to it, but it was more just an idea you throw in the back of a 10-year promotion file. It wasn't much of a fleshed out idea. But when that novel came out, I read that and I just inhaled that novel. And what was so fascinating to me about it was to see how politically minded Harper Lee was. Because in To Kill a Mockingbird, the politics of that novel are somewhat refracted because she's writing in the late 1950s about the 1930s, and so, but in Ghost at a Watchman, she's writing about the time in which she's living, and all of the kind of political references in it. Of course, I got immediately as a historian, as a political historian of the massive resistance era South, and so immediately I was just fascinated by that novel, less as a novel because it's a flawed novel. It's a first novel, and like so many first novels, there are lots of problems with it. But as a historical source, right, into her thinking and her creative process, to the issues that she's wrestling with, it was absolutely fascinating. And so that began for me the search of trying to think about, and it's also one of the great things we had with that, is we had this thing that historians love when something changes over time, right? That's all we do as historians. We follow change over time, right? And that's what that source allowed me to do, that Atticus was one, she initially conceived of Atticus in this one way, and then he became something else. And so how did that happen? And what does the historical context and the political context, and also the history that she had learned from her father, and the example of her father, and that's what sent me back to try to learn a lot more about her father, who obviously, who we've known for so long influenced the character, but we didn't know a lot about him.
And I want to return to him in just a second. It just so happens I was reading your book at the same time as I was reading President Carter's new book on faith, so which also deals with a similar time period and some very similar issues, including the White Citizens Council.
Yeah.
And I didn't fully understand until I read his biography about his direct reaction, resistance, and so I read this book, how large and massive that movement was.
Yeah.
I had it in my head, I don't know why, that it was smaller and there wasn't as much pressure as was directly put on people, President Carter being one example, and Harper Lee's father being another example of somebody he was in kind of a debate or dialogue on that particular topic about how much to respond to it, how to write about it in his editorials. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the Citizens Council movement was very formidable, not everywhere in the South. The Citizens Councils weren't big in Atlanta, but they were a big deal in Southwest Georgia. They were a big deal in Southwest Alabama. southeast Alabama, particularly in the Black Belt areas of the South, those areas that tend to have either majority African American population, the historic old areas of the South where slavery was most deeply entrenched, because those were the most fertile lands, And so across the Black Belt South, across the rural South, the citizens' councils were enormously influential and played a huge role in shaping kind of resistance politics in the 1950s. Now, Harper Lee's father himself, we don't know whether he was in the Citizens Council. One of the things I do discover in my research is that there was a Citizens Council in Monroeville, Harper Lee's hometown. And it coming to Monroeville was a controversial thing. The editor of the newspaper, who had bought the newspaper from A.C. Lee, writes this editorial in late February that we don't need a Citizens Council here. They're just going to stir up resentment. And we have good relations between our colored folks and they would have called them Negroes in that era, right? We have good relations between blacks and whites in Monroeville, and they're just going to stir up trouble and this kind of thing. But he's quickly kind of cast aside, and over 1,000 people come out for the first meeting of the Citizens Council. And we know, too, from these wonderful letters that we have up here in Rose Library, for the first time, that Harper Lee spent a lot of 1956, when all that was happening, when that was the live issue in Monroeville, she spent a lot of that time in Monroeville helping to care for her father, who had had his first serious illness and a long-term illness, and she was helping nurse him back to health.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you about some of your sources, and Jennifer referenced these. First, before we get to the materials that are in the Rose Library, you also spent a lot of time searching through old newspapers, right?
Yeah, that's right. The newspapers were the Monroe Journal, right. the newspaper. We knew all along that A.C. Lee, Harper Lee's father, was like Atticus Finch, a small-town lawyer and a state legislator. But what people have not paid attention to, that he was also the owner and the sole editor of this newspaper from 1929 to 1947. And no one had really looked at those papers at all. And I had it on my list of things to do to go look at those papers at some point, because that's what historians do. We look at old things. And
things that change and old things.
Things that change and old things. And so I go over to Montgomery, to the state archives, and I start March 1933. Because March 1933, what happens? Does anybody know? Ben knows. We've talked about it before. That's right. That's when FDR is inaugurated. That's when that's the inauguration. So I just want to see what he's writing then. And, it wasn't a given that there would be an editorial page in a small-town Alabama newspaper. A lot of them didn't have editorial pages. Or if they do, they might write an editorial once in a blue moon about when there's down during election season. But I pulled it up, and A.C. Lee had not just an editorial page, but he had this incredibly active editorial page where he's writing 3 or 4 editorials a week.
And did you know that before you delved into it?
No, not at all.
That was a complete surprise.
And so immediately, I read for a month, and all of a sudden I'm like giddy because I'm like, this is a gold mine. This is an absolute gold mine. And so I get through as much as I can, and I come back and I call Erica Brushko, and I was like, Erica, how can I get more of these? And Erica's like, well, I'll just buy some for you, Joe. And Erica did, and she bought these copies from the archives in Alabama.
So shout out to Erica and the Woodruff Library.
Yes. Thank you very much, Erica Brushko. And so we have a long run of them. We don't have all of them, but we don't have the ones that I've already looked at in Alabama. Maybe we should get those and fill them in, Erica. When I started doing that, and that took months to do, and to cross-reference and to make sense of, and to pull out the themes.
But then you had raw material.
Oh, and then I had all this amazing raw material.
And that set you on a search for additional information, additional material, rare materials?
Yeah.
Is that what catapulted you into looking around elsewhere?
Yeah, well, what that did was gave me this story about A.C. Lee. And everybody has wondered, since Ghost Set of Watchmen came out, how do you explain these two different versions of Atticus Finch? And you see both versions just in those editorials. You see how A.C. Lee he was a principled kind of conservative who took stands against kind of political demagoguery in the 1930s South. He spoke out in favor of intervention in the war in Europe when isolationists were trying to keep Roosevelt out of the war, when the original America Firsters were on the make in American politics. And so, I got to see all that, but we still don't, and so there was so much there in terms of understanding how Harper Lee's complicated relationship with her father.
Right.
And there's more there, but your question is about what led me to these other sources. And I had to know more about the time in which she was writing, right? Because for all of us, the times that we write in shape, how we write and what we write, the topics we choose. I mean, this is kind of a primer in historical scholarship, right? But this is another thing, right? Historians always think about the times in which people write their histories shape the kinds of histories they write, and it shapes the kind of fiction and literature that they write. And so I had to figure out more ways of finding out more about what Harper Lee was doing at the time. So one of the great things that happened, this was very serendipitous, is I was up in New York at a conference, and I met a literature scholar who said, "Oh, you've got to see this video." Jonathan Burnham, who's the publisher of HarperCollins, was here at the City University of New York, the Graduate Center, talking about the publication of Ghost Set of Watchmen. And so I looked at the video. There was a transcript online, and he was talking about all of these files, all of these letters and memos in archives of HarperCollins that relate to the publication of Ghost Set of Watchmen in 1957, 58. And nobody had seen these, and it completely upended what we thought was the story about the relationship between Ghost Set of Watchmen and To Kill a Mockingbird. The commonly understood story is that To Kill a Mockingbird is this kind of highly revised version of Ghost Set of Watchmen.
The Ghost Set of Watchmen was like an early draft.
The Ghost Set of Watchmen was a first draft, and that it was revised into Mockingbird with the help of Tay Hohoff, who becomes this renowned New York literary editor. But the archives in the HarperCollins show a totally different story, that she always imagined. She began these as two separate novels, right? Ghost Set of Watchmen first, and then she turned to write about the childhood of this character, and these characters that she had originally written about, she wanted to write about them 20 years earlier. And that's very important to understand her kind of creative process through that. So those archives were incredibly important. And of course, how do you get access to that? Well, you just write Mr. Burnham a nice letter, right? And he responded, which was fantastic. And and I acknowledge him, and I want to continue to acknowledge him because this book couldn't have been possible without him. But another important set of sources were these letters that were in private hands, and from this rare books collector in San Diego, a lawyer named Paul Kennerson. Now, I didn't know Paul Kennerson, but Randall Burkett here at Rose Library knows everybody who's in the book collecting world. And so I knew that I emailed Randall, and I was like, Randall, how could I possibly meet this guy? And would it be crazy to ask him to come look at his letters? And Randall kind of schooled me on the whole world, gave me the 15-minute, quick and dirty lesson on that world. And he helped me get the address of Paul Kennerson, and I wrote him.
That's another advice for historians, is Talk to Randall.
Talk to Randall. That's right. I hope somebody's keeping a list.
We've got it.
That should be number 2, not number 5. Right. So I get in touch with Mr. Kennerson, and that took some finagling as well. But eventually, he found himself in Charleston, and he said, "Well, why don't you come over and meet me in Charleston?" And so I go over and meet Paul Kennerson in Charleston. It's like, and I get to look at these letters for like 4 hours in my hotel room. It was almost like a drug deal or something. It felt very odd, going over to do this. But I saw them, and we hit it off. And he was obviously he loves literature and he loves history.
And you.
And we just had a lot to talk about.
If you all see the opening photograph of Joe and myself, and that's Paul Kennerson with us. He's the person whose letters we have. And also the second part of that story involving Paul and the letters coming to Rose Library also involved Randall too.
Yes, absolutely. And I had and Paul has all of this amazing material, and I told him that he needs to come to Atlanta and see our wonderful library where we have a lot of wonderful things. And I knew that and he could introduce him around. So eventually he did that.
Yes, Randall came back from New York and said, we may have access to these, and Joe's very interested, and we talked to Paul that afternoon, and he was on a plane like 2 days later coming here. That all happened very quickly in February.
Yeah.
And when he arrived, he felt so compelled by you, by this project, but also the amazing resources that we have here at Emory and in the library in particular, that he just wanted to be a part of it.
Yeah.
So very, very... So there's a lot of serendipity, a lot of happy accidents, and a lot of twists and turns to this story. But when you read the book itself, it reads, very straightforwardly as a story, a biography of sorts. And I wonder, what I told you earlier was, as I was reading it, even though I'm somewhat familiar with your writing, I felt like there was a writer's voice emerging along with the historian's voice.
Thank you.
And I wondered if you'd be willing to read a short portion for us today.
I'm going to wet my whistle. So I'm reading a passage near the end of the book. This is in some ways kind of it's kind of a summary of what I've found over the course of how the story unfolds. But it ends at this, in the final chapter, I'm kind of talking about 1963, in this kind of delicious irony of history, that in April of 1963, the same month that Gregory Peck wins the Oscar for Best Actor for portraying Atticus Finch, that same month, Martin Luther King is arrested in Birmingham and sent to the Birmingham jail, where he writes Letter from Birmingham Jail. And of course, there's that famous passage from Birmingham Jail where King talks about the white moderate. And he's come to believe that the white moderate may be a bigger stumbling block than the Citizens' Council or the Klansmen. It's kind of the quintessential statement of how well-meaning white folks can get in the way of genuine racial progress, right? And I'm reflecting on this in this chapter, and it ends with King talking about, and it ends really with King's kind of amazing, kind of enduring faith in the power of moral force and of nonviolence. And King is reflecting on that in the book that Letter from Birmingham Jail becomes a part of. He publishes in 1964, Why We Can't Wait. So he ends with this phrase that one side, despite the violence that had occurred, he's talking in Birmingham, far greater violence that had been threatened never came to pass, King wrote, as one side would not resort to it, and the other was so often immobilized by confusion, uncertainty, and disunity. And then I start writing. The disunited white South, That was the side that Harper Lee and her people were on. It was to them that she had written a novel that would eventually be read and celebrated around the world as a timeless expression of universal values of moral courage, tolerance, and understanding. But she began the project confused and uncertain. In her first attempt at writing a novel, she had wanted to reconcile her abiding love and respect for her father with the hypocrisy and injustice that he and his generation of Southerners had too easily abided, all while defending him from the condescension of the Northern liberals. Yet through that process, and shaped too by the shifting politics of the day, she stumbled upon a simpler narrative, a father inspired by his love and hope for his children, doing the right thing in a time of crisis. In that story, Atticus rose to the occasion. At the moment when it really mattered, he was his best self. Of course, Mockingbird doesn't tell us that. We know it because in Watchman, we see this other side of Atticus. In Mockingbird, we know of him only as the children do, because that is the internal logic of the novel. With the publication of Watchman, however, we now know not only that the Atticus of Mockingbird was always too good to be true, but that Harper Lee knew it as well. She knew all the things that Jean Louise discovers in Watchman, that Atticus's kindly paternalism covered ugly beliefs about racial difference, that his willingness to represent black clients was in service to the racial status quo, that Calpurnia and all of Macomb's black population lived behind a veil, that what as a child she had assumed was genuine, reciprocal love and devotion across the color line was more like an elaborate act intended to ease for whites the guilt and for blacks the burden of racial injustice. She knew all of these things and yet never told us. Why?
Very nice. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So you say historians write about change, and we've talked about, and you reference, the changing view or information that we have about Atticus, what lay behind the story that we know. And you also allude to changes with Harper Lee. After reading her letters that she wrote, coming to know her in the kind of intimate way, and the letters that we do have here at Emory and the Rose Library are really playful and serious and self-reflective and critical, all of those things that one will write about in a letter that might not necessarily say to anyone else. Almost like a diary, it feels like, in a way, revealing. So how do you feel like over this arc of this period of writing that Harper Lee herself may have changed?
Yeah. The letters, by the way, these letters are fascinating, and I only scratched the surface of these letters.
Tell a little bit more about
You've got to get in to read these letters. There's just a lot there. There's a tremendous amount there. One of the things and most of them are from, the reason they're so great too, is because they're from, there are Harper Lee letters out there that are in private hands, but they're all from like the 80s and 90s and this kind of thing. These are letters from, most of them are from the late 1950s and a couple in the early 1960s. And they give it, and this is the critical period. I mean, Harper Lee, as far as we know, Harper Lee just wrote 2 novels, right? And she began them both in 1957.
So she's in the moment.
So this is right in the, these letters speak to right in the moment when she's, I once referred to it as the most productive part of, the most productive time in her literary career, but really it was the only productive time in her literary career,
Well,
as far
pretty good,
as
right?
far as, yeah, she did pretty good though, didn't she? Yeah, she did okay. So that's what's so great about the letters. And one of the things, there's some great evidence from these letters that suggest that after Mockingbird is published, and there's all this incredible success, everyone was asking, what's next? What's next? Of course, this is true for every writer. Nobody, when you have a book comes out, and it's like, well, what are you going to work on next? Like, I just finished a book. Let me enjoy that.
I am going to ask that question.
I know. But everyone's asking what's next, and she's always says she's working on something. And there's a wonderful letter in this collection where she's talking about her frustration that Esquire magazine, an editor at Esquire magazine, had commissioned her. She's the darling now of the Southern literary scene, and Esquire commissions her to write this piece on kind of the state of the South, And she works up a piece, and they reject it. They don't run it, and she's miffed, and she describes the piece. We haven't found the piece, It may not exist anymore, but she describes the piece, and she describes it as that this New York literary editor couldn't believe that there would be segregationists in Alabama who despised the Klan, right? And there's another line in there too that suggests that she's still struggling. This is exactly the theme of Watchman, right? That the North doesn't understand these complicated folks like Atticus Finch, who could join the Citizens Council but still be an honorable man, right? And so it suggests that she's still trying to work through these themes, and that she's not doing it in a terribly convincing fashion, at least to this editor from Esquire. And Harper Lee was wrong, by the way. The editor from Esquire was actually a native North Carolinian. She didn't know that. I mean, so he was from the South. He wasn't just this kind of obtuse guy from outside the region. So what's interesting in some of these sources is that we can begin to kind of try to draw some conclusions about what was happening after and what she was thinking about, and to try to answer that question, which I don't think we can answer right now, and maybe someone else, a literary biographer of Harper Lee, it won't be me, can try to answer that question of why she doesn't come back to. I offer some thoughts on that in the epilogue.
Yeah, you want to
and
mention? You want them to read it. Yes.
Well, no, but I mean, this is a piece of it. This is a big piece of the evidence that we can kind of speculate off of, that we can't answer. But it's also, I think, and I argue in the book, that by 1963 and 64, Atticus Finch is doing a lot of kind of important political work in the world. And I mean, the United States State Department is printing up copies of To Kill a Mockingbird in all the languages, in 16 of the 23 official languages of the nation of India, right? And that book is being disseminated around the world to tell this story, right, of an Alabama Brahmin defending an untouchable, in the midst of a Cold War in which the United States is very much interested in advancing a certain narrative about, or countering a certain narrative about racism in the South that is being broadcast by its, by the Soviet Union and by its political opponents. So it's trying to think about the political work that the novel is doing, not only, and it's also a time in 1964 when George Wallace is running for the Democratic presidential nomination and winning, over 35% of the vote in Wisconsin, roughly the same amount of the vote that it coheres with Donald Trump's approval ratings these days, kind of in the high 30s. That's the percentage of the vote that he was winning in Indiana, in Wisconsin, and in Maryland in the Democratic primaries in 1964. So that's some of the things that we need to think about as we think about this question of why.
There's a lot of interest in this work, and there was a lot of interest in Go Set a Watchman, and there's always been a lot of interest in To Kill a Mockingbird. What is it in our time, in our moment, what is the contextualization of our time and our moment where these characters and these themes, these ideas, these debates are either informed you or you feel like we're in dialogue with them through literature and history? What is it about this moment?
Well, this book did gain a lot of momentum for me after November 8th, 2016, because that was such an unprecedented presidential election, right? I mean, if there's anything that's distinctive about American politics, if there's a rule of American exceptionalism in national politics in this country, it has always been you run to the right or to the left in the primaries and you come back to the center for the general. You know, that has been the ironclad rule of every presidential election in modern times, and that didn't happen, right? And that didn't happen. Donald Trump never came back. And we see in our politics today so many of our kind of political traditions and precedents that are being broken, you know, one after the other. We also see things that we thought we would never see, you know, that remind us a lot of massive, or we thought we'd seen it for the last time in the massive resistance era of the Deep South, like what happened in Charlottesville. Looked a lot like what happened in Tuscaloosa in 1956 when Arthurine Lucy became the first African American to enroll at the University of Alabama, right? So all of those, you know, the extremism, the hostility, the blatantly racist rhetoric that we see in our politics today in ways that we probably haven't seen since the 1950s and 60s certainly resonated for me and was a motivating factor for me to think about how Harper Lee was struggling with this kind of conservative, principled figure, this father figure that was so formidable for her. And she was trying to make sense of that conservative tradition in a moment in Southern history in which the forces of militant segregationist reaction were coming to the fore. And what were those conservative folks doing? You know, they weren't standing up to it. They weren't speaking out against it in the way that she had assumed her father had always done, you know, in the past. And so it's a fascinating kind of parallel story about kind of conservatism and reactionary politics in the South in the 1950s and 60s. And I think it has resonance. I don't try to draw this in the book because I don't want to date this book. This is its own story. But it's certainly something that I was thinking about as I was writing the book.
So we talked a little bit about how A.C. Lee, in effect, changes, or our information about him changes, at least, our understanding of him through the research you did. We talked about Atticus changing in the different versions of him. A little bit about Harper Lee. So I want to ask you about, for yourself, do you feel you experienced change as a historian in thinking, or as a writer, and thinking about your approach to materials, how you wrote about it, what you said? Was it kind of liberating in a way to write about a fictional character, or was, you know, as opposed to Strom Thurmond, for instance? That's another, you know, fascinating but also divisive person that you've written about. How did your process evolve or shift over time, and then what kind of experiential change did you have, or are you having even now as this comes to fruition?
Yeah, these are all good questions. I don't know that I have very good answers for them, but I mean, I always thought about this issue about writing a biography of a fictional character that, you know, there's no right way to do that, right? And therefore, that means there's no wrong way to do it either.
And did you have any models?
Well, I had, there were books out there that I had admired and thought about, you know, Jill Lepore, you know, a historian at Harvard who writes a lot for the New Yorker, had written a lovely little book on Wonder Woman, you know, that I like that book a lot. And there are others. I mean, Sean Wilentz, historian at Princeton, writes a lot about Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan is his own kind of fictional character, right? I mean, he kind of creates this myth, which is interesting. So
they're mythic figures.
Yeah, they're mythic figures. That's right. And so those were books that kind of inspired me and made me think about this kind of approach. But in terms of the actual process, it was the same process of kind of working through sources and trying to put together a story. And one of the things I really am gratified to hear you say about that this is a story, because I really did want to tell it as a story. As a story of the first line is Atticus, like the Christ child himself. Atticus Finch was born on Christmas. And because it was Christmas of 1956 that Harper Lee gets this gift from her friends, where she is allowed to write to quit her job as an airline reservationist and write for a year. And that's when she begins drafting right away, Go Set a Watchman. And so I wanted to tell it as a story. Luckily, and I didn't know that I was going to be able to do it, but it was, I do feel very fortunate in the way that these sources emerged at the right time that allowed me to tell that story.
I was also wondering if, growing up in the South yourself and now having lived, a good bit or most of your life here in the South, if the tradition of storytelling, because that, to me, is what seems to inform this, as well as To Kill a Mockingbird. There's a story that's being told, and even though it's a story for, about children, and presumably for children or young people, young adults, it's a story that resonates with everybody here. So if that tradition of storytelling has informed your work as a writer, both for this work and for your other work as a historian.
It may have. I'm not certain. I do think that I definitely that this place, Monroeville, Alabama, and Macomb, Alabama, the fictional version, is a place that I knew very well, because I grew up in Macon, Mississippi, and of course, so many people who grow up in small towns in the South love To Kill a Mockingbird because their small town was exactly the same. It had all the zany characters and the Miss DeBoses and all the rest. And I could tell you all the parallel figures of the characters that I grew up in this town, where my mother was from, and her family had moved there and was one of the founders of that town in Noxubee County. They moved there in the 1830s from North Carolina. So I think if there is a voice or storytelling voice in the book, it's in part because of my experience growing up in that place, and so many of the figures were so familiar to me. I mean, A.C. Lee in particular. A.C. Lee is a devout Methodist layman. My grandfather, Hardin, was a devout Methodist layman. I never knew him, but my mother would always tell me these stories about my grandfather and what a beloved person he was in the town, and how much he meant to the First United Methodist Church in Macon, Mississippi, and how he was always there. And this was A.C. Lee, right? A.C. Lee went to the annual conferences and was this loyal, faithful servant of the church. That
reminds me, there are several Emory connections beyond you and beyond the letters, right, in this book that you reveal.
Yeah, the Lees were a very loyal Methodist family.
Right.
And one of A.C. Lee's heroes was Bishop Candler. And he wrote 5 or 6 editorials that I found about Bishop Candler, and who was a great influence. He was a great admirer of Bishop Candler, who was the president here at Emory for many, many years.
So I don't want to ask you the question directly about what's your next project, because I like you, I think all of us want to celebrate this particular moment. But I am interested to know if, in working in this book, feels like a diversion, or if it feels like it's taking you on a pathway that will think about projects you haven't thought about before, or thinking about them in new ways, and what some examples might be.
Yeah. I find that projects for me, there is no rhyme or reason to it. And I just desperately try to find an idea wherever I can find it, you know? And so I don't have a trajectory or a plan, or, I mean, you know, when I was still, before I became a full professor, I did, because you'd have those reviews and you had to say something, you know, about where you're going and all that kind of stuff. But it was always fiction, right? It was always just the best, you know, I mean, I'm glad my bosses aren't here. But
there are a few of your historian colleagues out.
They know, though. They're in on it. They know the game. But it's always just your best guess, right? And so it is in some ways a work of fiction. So I'm still just trying to find topics where, for me, up to this point in my career, it has been you muddle through. It doesn't look like it's going to work. You have 2 or 3 things going at the same time, and then there's a moment where you get momentum, and all of a sudden the oven is hot and you can go, or whatever it is, whatever the metaphor is.
Sort of catalyst.
Yeah, something. And for this project, well, there were a couple in this project. There was the publication of Ghosts at a Watchman, and then there was the finding the editorials, and then things started really rolling. So I'm looking for that catalytic event in the next project, which is about Atlanta, which is about struggles over race and religion in the prophet's hometown, right? Riffing off of that famous passage from the New Testament, you know, Jesus as a prophet is never welcome in his hometown. When King comes back to Atlanta from Montgomery, and what's going on in Atlanta? What are these kinds of crises that are happening in churches and in communities, in the white community and in the black community? And I'm still trying to put together the sources that allow me to happen with that. But there are there's these amazing figures who've emerged, who I'm just fascinated with and want to write more about William Holmes Borders, who who older generations of Atlantans will recognize the name. Current Atlantans will recognize Lisa Borders, who's his granddaughter. But William Holmes Borders was just this amazing figure, you know, who Martin Luther King Jr. used to sneak out of his dad's church to go hear him preach. At Wheat Street, he would leave Ebenezer to go down the street to Wheat Street to hear him preach. He was an amazing minister and preacher. And he's a big figure in this. And also people like, and I love discovering people like Roy McLean. Who knows Roy McLean, right? Who was the minister at First Baptist Atlanta, who in his day was one of the great kind of television. He was a great minister too. I mean, great preacher. And learning his story about when there's a crisis at First Baptist because there are students from Atlanta University Center who are kneeling in, right? Who are protesting the segregation at First Baptist, and it's an ongoing ordeal there in which this minister named Ashton Jones, this kind of quixotic figure who had gone to Candler, he got his degree at Candler, is arrested and jailed for protesting, and he's put in jail by this judge, and he's actually not in the article that's written by the British journalist that becomes the seed for the formation of Amnesty International, these prisoners of conscience around the globe. One of the prisoners of conscience was Ashton Jones, who was arrested on the steps of First Baptist Atlanta. You know, so these are kind of amazing stories about this period in the city's history and in the struggles over civil rights in this country that I want to recover.
So you have this rich place, you have these many threads, and you follow them, and then until you hit upon something propels you in a direction that will tie these different stories together.
And that's right. And that's one of the things that I guess I have the luxury to do now as a professor is to wait for that story to emerge. But I think it's important for me just at this point in my career as a writer and as a historian to put these things together in a story. And of course, we know as a professional historian there's an artifice to that. There are compromises that get made in the telling of that.
Choices.
And the choices one makes, and one wants to be cognizant of that. But I do think that that is the most compelling and meaningful way for me to write right now. And so that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, for sharing this book. It's now available, and you will be signing copies of the book immediately after this, as well as sharing with us how this story emerged for you and giving us an idea of what may emerge in the future. So this has been really a wonderful experience for me, Joe. Thank you so much, and congratulations.
And before we stop, are you going to do more of these creativity conversations?
Myself?
Yeah.
Well, as invited.
Well, I just want to thank you as part on behalf of the Emory community gathered here for all of your work, both at Rose Library and through these conversations that you spearheaded. And it's been wonderful working, and I'm very honored to be
Well,
here.
thank you so much. My pleasure entirely. Thank you.